ouverte. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Bienvenue à la réunion numéro...
Good afternoon. Welcome to the 93rd meeting of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Industry and Technology. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. And pursuant to the order of reference of Monday, April 24, 2023, the committee is resuming consideration of Bill C-27, an act to enact the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, the Personal Information and Data Protection Tribunal Act, and the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, and to make consequential and related amendments to other acts. I'd like to welcome our witnesses today and also issue an apology for our delay due to votes in the House. From the Canadian Bankers Association, we have Lorraine Krugel, Vice President, Privacy and Data. Good day. From the Canadian Labour Congress, Siobhan Vipond, Executive Vice President, and Chris Roberts, Director, Social and Economic Policy. From the Centre for Digital Rights, Jim Balzilli, Founder. From the Financial Data and Technology Association of North America, Steve Baums, who is here by video conference. Good afternoon, Mr. Baums. Welcome. From the Canadian Marketing Association, we have Sarah Claudman, Vice President, Public Affairs and Thought Leadership, David Elder, Head of Privacy and Data Protection Group, Stikeman Elliott, and from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Catherine Fortin-Lefebvre, Vice President, Strategic Policy and Global Partnerships, as well as Ulrich Bar-Gedalia, Senior Director, Digital Economy, Technology and Innovation. That is a large number of witnesses with us this afternoon. Thank you for being here. I would inform our colleagues that we have until 6 p.m. this evening, so FYI. Madam Krugel, you have the floor. 5 minutes.
I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to speak on Bill C-27's Consumer Privacy Protection Act, or CPPA. My name is Lorraine Krugel, and I am the Vice President, Privacy and Data for the Canadian Bankers Association. The CBA is the voice of more than 60 banks operating in Canada, employing more than 280,000 Canadians and helping to drive Canada's economic growth and prosperity. Banks have long been entrusted with significant amounts of personal information, and privacy and trust are paramount to our bank's customer relationships. As global data flows and technological advances have continued to increase, Canadian banks have been able to responsibly innovate to meet consumer demand for even more convenience, value, and simplification. The CPPA reflects a unique, made-in-Canada approach that aims to address the needs of consumers and organizations in our evolving digital world. But we need to get this right. Some of the proposed provisions in the CPPA need to be better tailored for the Canadian context. We are concerned there is a real risk of significant adverse consequences if the scope of certain provisions are not better defined and necessary exceptions are not included. In particular, we would like to avoid situations where organizations would be required to provide too much information in order to be transparent. For example, certain transparency provisions could end up replicating the equivalent of consent fatigue or cookie banner fatigue, with no meaningful value to the consumer. Transparency obligations also require appropriate limits, so they cannot be abused or leveraged by criminals to circumvent processes designed to protect against fraud, money laundering, or cyber threats. In addition, we need to take care so that any requirements that are highly complex or operationally onerous would in fact address the right underlying risks and policy intent without negatively impacting legitimate operations, product and service delivery, or safeguarding of information. The CBA is supportive of many of the key foundations of the CPPA. The CPPA is principles-based, scalable, and technology neutral, and requires organizations to comply with the collection of interconnected provisions that provide a solid privacy foundation based on accountability, reasonability, and proportionality. However, we see the need for targeted amendments in the following key areas: de-identification and anonymization, disposal requests and retention, and automated decision systems. Relating to consent, we recommend an important technical amendment which will ensure continued alignment with provincial approaches while preserving policy intent and avoiding unintended consequences regarding consent obligations. In addition, we recommend an amendment to the CPPA to legally allow certain organizations to share personal information to combat money laundering and terrorist financing as part of a legislative framework that would be further defined through the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act. Done in the right way, such sharing could increase privacy protections for Canadians by reducing unnecessary reporting to the government on low-risk transactions and simultaneously increase the effectiveness of Canada's anti-money laundering regime through targeted and more effective reporting. Finally, we believe a minimum 2-year implementation period is necessary to accommodate the scope of change and development of regulations and guidance associated with the CPPA. Regarding the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, or ADA, we are in the process of evaluating the Minister's recent proposals and will be submitting comments and our recommendations to the committee when study focuses on the AI portions of the bill. We have provided the committee with written comments and recommendations on the CPPA and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Krugel. I'll now turn to the Canadian Labour Congress. The floor is yours.
And good afternoon, committee members. It's my honor to be here with you today. The 55 national and international unions affiliated with the Canadian Labour Congress bring together 3 million workers in virtually all sectors, industries, occupations, and regions of the country. We are grateful for the opportunity to speak to the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, ADA, enacted by Bill C-27. Across sectors, industries, and occupations, workers in Canada increasingly encounter AI applications in their work and employment. Many report that AI has the potential to improve and enrich their work. In certain instances, AI applications could reduce time and energy spent on routine tasks. This could free up workers to focus on more skill-intensive aspects of their jobs or directly serving the public. However, workers are also concerned about the negative potential consequences for jobs, privacy rights, discrimination, and workplace surveillance. Workers are troubled by the potential for displacement and job loss from AI. Workers in creative industries and the performing arts are concerned about control over and compensation for their images and their work. Workers are concerned about the collection, use, and sharing of workers' personal data. Workers and unions are concerned about the use of AI in hiring, discipline, and human resource management functions. And almost every week we hear from workers who have real-life experiences of the impact this is already having on their jobs. AI systems carry serious risks of racial discrimination, gender discrimination, and labor and human rights violations. The number one demand from Canada's unions is greater transparency, consultation, and information sharing around the introduction of AI systems in the workplace and in Canadian society. Unfortunately, ADA falls short in this respect. Our concerns about ADA are as follows. Unions are troubled by the lack of public debate and broad consultation on regulating AI in Canada. We feel there should have been proper public debate prior to the drafting and introduction of ADA. Second, the major deficiency of ADA is that it exempts government and crown corporations. The Government of Canada is a leading adopter and promoter of AI. And despite this, ADA provides no protection for public service workers whose work and employment is affected by AI systems. Government is responsible for many high-impact AI systems, from decision-making regarding immigration and benefits claims to policing and military operations. ADA should be expressly expanded to apply to all federal departments and agencies and crown corporations, including national security institutions. Third, the bill only requires measures to prevent harms caused by high-impact systems. It leaves the definition of high-impact systems to regulation. As well, it is silent on AI systems that can cause real harms and discrimination despite falling outside the classification of high impact. Fourth, ADA contemplates a senior Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada official acting as the AI and Data Commissioner. The Commissioner should be an independent position. An office tasked with supervision and regulatory oversight should not be housed within the department responsible for promoting the AI industry. And fifth, while ADA authorizes the minister to establish an advisory committee, we strongly believe the government must go further than the current advisory council on artificial intelligence established in 2019. The advisory council is dominated by industry and academic voices with no participation from civil society, human rights advocacy organizations, unions, and the public. The CLC urges the government to create a permanent representative advisory council to make recommendations on research needs, regulatory matters, and administration and enforcement of ADA. Finally, the purpose clause of the Act should be strengthened. Currently, ADA is intended in part to prohibit certain conduct in relation to artificial intelligence systems that may result in serious harm to individuals or harm to their interests. This should be revised to prohibit conduct that may result in harm to individuals or groups and not just serious harm. Currently, ADA is focused on individual harms, but not societal risks, such as the environment or Canadian democracy. In summary, the CLC believes that there should be much more institutionalized transparency, information sharing, and engagement around AI in workplaces and in Canadian society. Thank you, and I welcome any questions the committee may have.
Thank you very much, Madam Vipon. I'll now turn to Mr. Balsillie for the Centre for Digital Rights. The floor is yours.
Chairman Lightbound, honourable members, thank you for the opportunity to share my views on Bill C-27, legislation that will have profound consequences on Canada's economic prosperity, freedom, democracy, consumer protections, and child well-being. The Digital Charter Implementation Act prioritizes the interests of large data monopolies and their ecosystem of traffickers. It sets a dangerous precedent by allowing corporations to allocate to individuals, children, and vulnerable groups the harmful economic, political, and social consequences of the data-driven economy. It normalizes and expands surveillance, treating human rights as an obstacle to corporate profits. C-27 requires a wholesale redo, and my written submission includes comprehensive proposed amendments. A high-level perspective of some of the foundational flaws with the bill as tabled include, number one, use of a notice and consent framework which creates a pseudo-compliance system that enables personal data harvesting and intrusive profiling while spamming users with misleading consent barriers. Two, a legitimate business interest carve-out that allows corporations to put the pursuit of profits above the interests of consumers. Businesses are allowed to privately self-determine what constitutes legitimate surveillance and behavioral modification to trample on fundamental rights, but are under no obligation to notify consumers how they are tracking and profiling them. Three, a diminishment of protections for children and vulnerable persons, and a mission of meaningful measures that curtail insidious surveillance and behavioral manipulation practices that are driving the current youth mental health crisis. Four, an Artificial Intelligence Data Act that doesn't include an independent and expert regulator for automated decision systems and excludes the right to contest decisions made with AI, such as insurance, school admissions, and credit scoring. AI needs to be scrapped completely. There are many, many more flawed parts of this legislation, all detailed in my submission. The recent letter by Minister Champagne indicating willingness to make some unspecified amendments is a woefully inadequate approach to dealing with the serious flaws in this bill. It joins the long list of bad governance practices, which is how we ended up with this untenable bill in the first place. There has been much gaslighting from industry lobbyists and self-interested parties whose profits depend on mass surveillance, arguing that meaningful AI privacy regulations limit innovation. Privacy and AI regulation are not impediments to innovation. As innovation economists and digital policy experts have shown, the unique features of the data-driven economy, specifically data's network effects, alongside economies of scope, scale, and information asymmetry, mean that the more data a company gathers, the more value it gains from it. Every new data set makes all pre-existing data sets in the hands of the same few companies more valuable, disproportionately enhancing the power of established data giants and their vested assets. This is why, in less than a decade of the data-driven economy, we have seen the greatest market and wealth concentrations in economic history, a reduced rate of entrepreneurship, innovation, and business dynamism, and also lowered wages. Properly regulating insidious data collection and trafficking, as other jurisdictions are doing, would not only address concentrated economic power, but also force business to compete on the level of quality and innovation, not surveillance and manipulation, as is currently the case. I am an entrepreneur, investor, and co-founder of the Council of Canadian Innovators, and a vocal advocate for Canadian technological and innovation success in global markets. It's deeply troubling to hear the government talk about advancing Canadian innovation because earlier this year, the government has admitted it has no AI strategy. We are merely funding basic research that principally supports the growth of foreign data monopolies. This lack of capacity to understand and regulate the digital economy has real consequences. Chief among them, a steady decline in the standard of living and prosperity for the average Canadian, particularly in Ontario and Quebec, which used to drive our national prosperity. Because Canada is unable to create policies to harness the potential of IP, data, and AI, the OECD recently projected that Canada's economy will be, and I quote, the worst performing advanced economy over 2020 to 2030 and the 3 decades thereafter, end of quote. The choice you have is to adopt C27, a deeply flawed attempt at privacy regulation, or create new legislation that builds trust in the digital economy, supports Canadian prosperity and innovation, and protects Canadians not only as consumers, but as citizens. The choice is a continued erosion of Canadian prosperity, emboldening surveillance and manipulation, and deepening the mental health crisis of our youth, or a healthy democracy, long-term prosperity, robust freedoms, and the protection of our children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Balsillie. We'll now turn to the Financial Data and Technology Association of North America, Mr. Bums, who joins us online. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon. I am the Executive Director of the Financial Data and Technology Association of North America, or FDATA. We're the leading trade association advocating for consumer permissioned access to financial data in both Canada and the United States. Our members include firms with a variety of different business models that collectively provide more than 6 million Canadian consumers and SMEs with access to vital financial services and products. Utilizing these products, services, and tools, Canadian consumers can, for example, access more competitive banking services, including more affordable credit. They can utilize more efficient payment options and benefit from technology to better manage their finances and grow their wealth. Canadian SMEs depend on FDATA North America member companies to manage their accounting and credit needs and more easily send and receive payments. We are strong advocates of Canada's implementation of an open finance regime, which was first outlined as a government priority in Budget 2018. The core idea of open finance is this: a Canadian consumer or SME should be able to safely and securely share access to their data held at one provider with another provider that offers a better financial product, service, or tool. Whether it's a checking, savings, business, brokerage, pension, mortgage, or auto loan account, or data held by a payroll or benefits provider, open finance is the straightforward notion that the customer should have the right to use that data for their own benefit. Once built, open finance in Canada will put consumers and SMEs in full control of their financial data, facilitating a more transparent and competitive Canadian financial services marketplace that provides safe and secure data portability. The data portability right and data privacy framework included in Bill C-27 are fundamental cornerstones of this modernized approach to financial services. A survey of Canadians commissioned last year by FDATA North America and Fintechs Canada found half of Canadians feel stress when interacting with Canada's existing financial services sector, and that more than 2/3 of Canadians believe more competition in the financial services marketplace would lead to a greater choice in products and lower financial services fees. 90% of Canadians indicated they found fintech products easy to use, with more than 80% reporting they paid lower fees to fintechs than to their banks for similar services or products. Canadians deserve access to these alternatives. Canada lags behind virtually every other G20 country with regard to open finance, data portability, and data privacy. The UK, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Brazil, the EU, and other jurisdictions have all enacted some version of government-led open finance under which consumers and SMEs have legally binding data access rights and privacy protections afforded to them. In contrast, today, Canadian consumers and SMEs have no legal right to access or share access to their financial data. Unlike the overwhelming majority of other countries, In Canada, a consumer's or SME's bank is empowered to determine whether their customer may share elements of their data with a third party to get a better deal, access a new product or tool, or avoid paying exorbitant fees. To the extent that a bank may allow its customers to do so, there are generally onerous and in some cases restrictive terms dictating the limitations under which their customers are able to do so. While Canada has taken important steps towards such a regime since Budget 2018, significant work remains to reach implementation. Meanwhile, the rest of the world advances. Earlier this month, the United States formally launched its own open finance regime with a CFPB rulemaking. Recognizing that incumbents in the financial services market will not on their own deliver a more competitive customer-centric ecosystem, the director of the CFPB noted in his announcement that the rule will, quote, supercharge competition, improve financial products and services, and discourage junk fees. Like Bill C-27, the CFPB rule would provide data portability rights to consumers and will require those firms that access with their express consent and users' data abide by strict privacy and security protections. To advance its open finance regulations, the U.S. had an advantage that departments of finance and innovation, science, and economic development currently do not. Strong statutory authority to do so. Finance Canada has been studying how to deliver open finance in Canada for the better part of 5 years. FData views enactment of C-27 as a critical element of the transition from open finance ideation to implementation. Once consumer and SME data portability have been enshrined in law, ISET and Finance Canada will have the statutory tools required to finally deliver open finance. Consumers and SMEs in Canada are being left behind as the rest of the G20 build and deploy open finance frameworks that facilitate competition, enable greater access to and inclusion within the financial services marketplace, and provide their citizens with appropriate data protections. The data portability and privacy provisions included in C-27 represent integrally important statutory tools for ISET and Finance Canada that will help Canada catch up. Thank you. I would be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. I'll now turn to the Canadian Marketing Association, Madame Claude-Man and Mr. Elder.
Good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting us to appear and for prioritizing privacy law reform. Your work is critically important to Canadians and to the future of our economy. I cannot overstate how reliant Canadians are on data and the digital economy, or how significant the proposed law is to Canada's future economic growth and to the protection of consumers. The CPPA will enable small and medium-sized Canadian businesses to compete in the global marketplace. It will protect consumers through new consumer rights, greater transparency and accountability requirements for organizations, and the strongest financial penalties in the G7. It will help protect children. It will provide some support to the more than 80% of Canadians who are concerned about rising costs. It will foster innovation and allow Canadians to enjoy the enormous social and economic benefits of data. The Canadian Marketing Association is the voice of the marketing profession. Our 450 members are small and medium-sized businesses, large brands, not-for-profits, and public and post-secondary institutions and organizations representing virtually all sectors of the economy. We urge the speedy adoption of the CPPA. Consumers deserve modernized protections, and the businesses fueling our economy need more regulatory certainty. Consumer trust is critical to a successful business. Most organizations operating in Canada are responsible and are committed to building and maintaining a trusted relationship with their customers. They dedicate significant attention and resources to protect personal information, including substantial investments in cybersecurity. Canada's privacy law must protect consumers in a manner that does not create an unnecessary administrative burden for companies, including SMEs, which make up more than 90% of Canadian businesses. Canadian consumers expect organizations to intuitively deliver the products and services that they need and want. They are demanding faster and better, more relevant information from companies to help them make informed purchase decisions. We are living in challenging economic times. 90% of consumers say one of the most important reasons for sharing their data with companies is to receive discounts on products and services. With more than 80% of Canadians concerned about the rising cost of living, the personalization that comes from data usage provides some relief through relevant offers and sales that save them time and money. To ensure that the CPPA meets its objectives while avoiding unintended consequences, we are proposing some limited amendments. Our First Amendment calls for a more targeted and effective approach to protecting the personal information of minors. the CMA unequivocally supports the protection of minors. For decades, we have been the leader in setting standards for marketing to children and youth through the Canadian Marketing Code of Ethics and Standards. We are concerned that the minors provision in the CPPA would result in an overcollection of data. Organizations who have no need to know whether their customers are minors should not be required to collect and retain people's birthdays, which is highly sensitive information, simply for the purpose of complying with the Act. We propose that the provision for children in the CPPA be targeted to organizations whose business is directed to minors and to organizations who know or should know that they are processing the personal information of minors. We also recommend that the law allow for different treatment of mature minors who bear many of the responsibilities and enjoy many of the privileges of adulthood. These recommendations align with laws in the US and Europe. We have a handful of amendments in other areas, including consent provisions and the definition of ADS. We support the amendments by the Canadian Anonymization Network regarding de-identified and anonymized data. And we recommend a phased-in implementation period similar to Quebec's. Our specific amendments are attached to our statement, and we are submitting a written brief outlining our views in more detail. I'd like to close my remarks by emphasizing what this legislation is about and what it is not. The CPPA is intended to govern commercial activities. It would apply not only to large businesses and digital players, but also to very small organizations and to non-digital business activities. It would govern the ability of not-for-profits and charities to find and retain donors. The CPPA is not meant to address all aspects of the digital economy. For example, competition issues regarding data monopolies, the use of AI, which falls under ADA, protecting children from online harms. These are all critically important issues, but do not fit within the scope of the CPPA. Chair and members, our current law, PIPEDA, was the international gold standard for the protection of personal information for more than a decade. The CPPA builds on a strong legacy that Parliament can be proud of. Your speedy passage of this law can once again ensure that Canada leads the world in protecting privacy and fostering innovation. I would like to thank the members of the committee for your leadership and service to Canadians. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Claudeman. Je passerai maintenant la parole.
Thank you. Madame Fortin-Lefebvre from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce.
Good afternoon. Bonjour. I'm pleased to appear before you on behalf of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and alongside my colleague, Ulrike Bar-Gedalia. La Chambre de commerce du Canada représente...
The Chamber of Commerce represents over 200,000 businesses of all sizes, from coast to coast, and in a wide variety of economic sectors.
We would like to state our support for modernizing privacy laws and for introducing guardrails regarding AI. We welcome the government's efforts to strengthen data protection for all Canadians, particularly children. CPPA must move forward to provide business certainty as soon as possible, while allowing for some amendments. There is concern about Canada's equivalency with the EU and the patchwork of provincial privacy legislation that is emerging in the interim. Regarding ADA, we believe that a more robust consultation process is required to properly address AI regulation needs in Canada. It's critical that our AI regulations are precise enough to provide important guardrails for safety, while allowing for our businesses to harness AI's full potential responsibly. This is especially relevant in the face of cross-sectoral skills shortages and SMEs that have dealt with one challenge after another. Suite à la lettre du ministre Champagne.
Through Minister Champagne's letter in October, we are pleased to hear that the government would address some major concerns related to ADA through their amendments, but we cannot substantially comment on these until they are made public and we've had time to consult with members.
Given the House Speaker's 2022 ruling that voting on Parts 1 and 2 would be separate from Parts 3, ADA, we urge the committee to contemplate how this avenue could allow for CPPA to move forward without delay, while making way for more in-depth consultations and input on the AI Act to take place. AI policy is indeed complex. Having the committee attempt to study privacy elements at the same time as quickly changing AI elements doesn't provide the conditions for good policy to materialize. It's important to deny It's impossible to deny that AI regulation has become a global issue that's evolving rapidly, and it's imperative that Canada not regulate in a vacuum. With major AI policy developments happening weekly, including just yesterday's White House executive order on AI, Canada must ensure that we're taking steps to align our regulations accordingly. If not, organizations will have to contend with unique laws, making our country a less attractive destination for business. Eureka?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And yeah, indeed, we have received a long list of C27 recommendations from our members. A detailed brief has been submitted to INDU in September and is available on the committee page, so you're all aware. Please note that our analysis of the bill is ongoing as new material becomes available, such as the 8 government amendments. As such, we are working with members to produce additional feedback to complement our earlier submission. I'd like to take the opportunity to underscore a few key recommendations. Firstly, a core position of the Canadian Chamber is the need for amendments to better define many of the principles and concepts in Bill C-27 and harmonize the bill with the norms and standards found in existing provincial and international law. Interoperability is paramount. Amongst our recommendations on CPPA, we are asking that the following align with Quebec's Law 25. Define the term minor with an H. Ensure the definition of anonymize is in line with industry standards. Narrow the scope of the private right of action. We also want to underscore the importance of legitimate interest exceptions in the current bill. On ADA, we were encouraged to see that government amendments would be forthcoming related to defining high-impact systems, creating clearer obligations along the AI value chain, and ensuring alignment with the EU AI Act and other advanced economies. So we look forward to seeing the text of these amendments to provide more specific feedback. However, other matters remain unaddressed thus far, such as better defining the use of the term harm. Our members have also raised serious concerns around the criminal liability element of ADA, noting that Canada is the only jurisdiction in the world with such penalties. There is a belief that this provision might discourage businesses developing or deploying AI from setting up operations in Canada, or even for some to leave based on risk assessment. Well, finally, in terms of coming into force, it's important that our businesses, especially SMEs, because small business is big business in Canada, have adequate time to adapt to new environments and requirements. We therefore recommend a phased implementation of CPPA on ADA over a period of 36 months. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Alors,
Thank you very much. So we'll start with our discussion. Mr. Perkins, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, witnesses, for, I know, the tremendous amount of work you've all done in preparing to be here today. And I want to thank you for the amount of time you've spent with me over the last number of months to expand and have a two-way conversation on how we can improve this bill. It's really 3 bills, but and a complete replacement of the Privacy Act, which is why it's so comprehensive and huge for us to deal with, and the Artificial Intelligence Bill, which would be, if we passed it, probably be the first country in the world to actually get one passed, because one hasn't really been passed yet that I'm aware of. So maybe I can start by, because we have limited time, Mr. Balsillie, as the co-founder of one of Canada's most iconic companies, BlackBerry, which we were all addicted to at one time. I wish I still was. And you have some expertise on the idea of innovation and what it takes to do innovation, but also the balance of protecting people's privacy. This new Liberal bill, which is on the privacy side, a bit of a rehashed bill from the last Parliament, which didn't make it through, in my view, puts the interests of corporations ahead of the individual and the protection of their privacy because of the purpose section, which is Clause 5, which says that it's of equal importance, protection of personal privacy or a fundamental right compared to businesses' access and use of that information, and then a subsequent series of clauses which actually give business more say, whether it's Clause 18 on legitimate interest or the exceptions to express consent. So I'd like to get your overall, just do you agree that it's putting the interest of large corporations and corporations in general ahead of individual privacy rights?
Yes, thank you for that question. A fundamental right should be inalienable, not be balanced. And in Europe, where you have the ability, it's a very narrowest of special circumstances, but this idea that it's some kind of balanced proportionality does not make it fundamental and does not make it inalienable. It's a fundamental flaw in approaching. It's either an important right or it's not.
So you would suggest then that if fundamental right is put into Section 5, as we had proposed, I think as the NDP had, and now the Minister acknowledges needs to be done, that it should have some sort of legal wording that gives that paramountcy over the corporation's right in that clause. In hearing witnesses so far, and we got a lot more to hear, we wish we could have more time than we have, but a number have said that we have to be very careful in finding the fine line and the balance between protecting individual privacy and squashing innovation and driving business out of Canada if we go too overboard on protecting an individual's privacy. Do you agree that that's a concern in protecting individual privacy?
Not at all. I have a bit of an advantage over everyone here in that I was in the small meeting where Minister Baines and Deputy Minister Nubley presented the original C11, and they said they're approaching this as some kind of balance. And I said, who concocted this concept of a trade-off between the two? They, in fact, reinforce one another. It's a false dichotomy.
So one of the ways that they do that, and I actually don't think it's a balance, it's slanted towards business, is in Section 15.5, which is the consent section. The bill actually allows for implied consent, and allows a business to say, oh, I think you agreed with this, so I'll decide to use your data. In Section 18.3, it says if a business's legitimate interests are more important than the individual's, then the corporation can use the data as it wishes, in fact, even if it harms people. And in Section 35, it says, it takes out the old thing about scholarly language or scholarly studies that says research can be done for scholarly studies, and in 35 it gives an organization the right to use data however they wish to collect and use data. So to me it seems pretty wide open. Would you agree that those clauses have to, and those specific clauses should be deleted from the bill?
Absolutely.
Okay. One of the issues that's come forward quite a bit that has been raised is this issue of collective group rights. As a marketer, I knew that I could buy databases from across the world and try and de-identify stuff and try and target certain people because of certain behaviors. Do you believe that this bill does anything to deal with the issue where corporations try and use group data to try and imply certain behaviors?
No, it doesn't, and it should, because when you make a decision, you affect those around you that are affected by the nature of the digital footprint we leave collectively. Also, if you opt out, but you are part of a group and they have agreed to these things, you are profiled in that even though you have pulled yourself out of it. So understanding both the individual effects and the collective effects need to be a central aspect of this bill.
The Center for Digital Rights presentation to the committee talks about cross-border flows of data, and we know that that's what businesses of all size do now, and that other jurisdictions have looked at this issue of cross-border flows of data, but this bill is silent on cross-border data flows. Can you outline what the sort of inherent dangers to protection of privacy are without any framework around cross-border flows and what you think should be included?
Sure. And that's the root of the contention between the EU and the US, that you must have a sufficiency realm that the data is going to that maintains the European threshold, or they don't allow the data to be transferred. And that's been the tremendous contention of the Europeans standing up for European citizens. And so if you have these rules here, but they can move to another jurisdiction that has lower standards, then all of those protections are stripped, even if it's boomeranging across, going from coast to coast to Canada, but it boomerangs through a node in the US, it's all stripped.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sorbara.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome, everyone. On C-27, obviously a very important bill for consumers, for individuals, an important bill for businesses, both domestically and internationally. One of the things I've been able to glean just from the testimony today is the regulatory alignment that's needed between us and other jurisdictions, and also that we in Canada benefit sometimes from what's called the fiscal federation, and sometimes the provinces move first, and sometimes we do, but we need to be on the same page due to the importance of the material here. To the Canadian Bankers Association, in 2018, I was part of Finance Committee where we did the statutory review on money laundering and terrorist financing, moving Canada forward. It was a report we issued in November 2018. You've raised some good things and some potential amendments and so forth with regards to the CPPA, with regards to money laundering and terrorist financing. Can you comment on that and add any more color that you wish to add on that vein?
Thank you for the question. Yes, with the money laundering piece, certainly when we look at other jurisdictions, Canada is behind with respect to combating money laundering and terrorist financing. There are other case studies that are already in play in Europe, Estonia, Netherlands, UK, and there is also information sharing in the US. And what this allows those organizations to do is to uncover networks of criminal organizations that are leveraging the fact that individual organizations in Canada have to report to the government, but they cannot follow up to see whether or not the transactions will go to another organization, and that other organization may not be reporting to the government. So the government cannot see the whole piece of the puzzle with respect to those criminal networks, and this information sharing will allow for more targeted and effective reporting, and we believe that it will actually increase the privacy of Canadians. Right now, when we look at the amount of reporting that goes from organizations to the government today, on a per capita basis, it's 12.5 times more than in the US and 96 times more than in the UK. So this approach that we're proposing is actually narrower than what the GDPR actually permits. Many organizations can leverage the legitimate interest provision in Europe to be able to do this type of sharing. Because the legitimate interest in the CPPA does not permit disclosures, we're proposing that it be linked to the Proceeds of Crime Act to really limit that sharing.
Okay, and just would like to follow up with, I believe it was the CMA who commented, and you stated enable small and medium-sized businesses to compete in the global economy through C-27 as it is. Can you elaborate on that? Going through C-27, it's a pretty in-depth bill, and I almost wish I went to law school to understand most of it, but we're trying to get through it. But if you can comment on that aspect quickly, and then I have a follow-up last question for Mr. Basili, if I have time.
Sure, thank you for the question. Yes, so for the law is designed to be principles-based, and it does take into account the size and type of business and activities that an organization is engaged in. It is very different from the European law, which is very prescriptive and requires pages and pages of box ticking and needs privacy lawyers to even help people understand. Even privacy lawyers there have trouble understanding the requirements. So for small businesses here, that would be very impossible. This bill is much more balanced.
Mr. Basili, just the last, I had the pleasure of sitting with you when Mr. Breton, the European Commissioner, was here. I believe it was last year or something to that extent. And I think we were talking somewhat about the issues that we're talking about today at the time. And the Europeans have been first movers in a lot of aspects of the new economy, or Industrial Revolution 4.0 or 5.0, whichever term, cliche term we want to use. You've brought your views here in terms of what you think is wrong and why, and that's I respect that. Of course we all do. But in terms of the modernization of what C27 intends to do, in terms of modernization of privacy and how we deal with privacy in AI, are there aspects of the bill where we are going in the right direction, or is it just absolutely, completely wrong direction?
Well, it's kind of like saying my bucket has 25 holes in it, and that's better than 30 holes. And if we get rid of 20 of the holes, then we only have 10 left. So I think the nature of the digital economy and the knowledge economy is it's nonlinear in its harms for imperfection. It takes a small hole to drive a truck through, and so you need relative completeness, or somebody will escape through a small hatch.
I will say, if we're getting rid of 20 of the 25 holes, I think we're making progress.
But you still have 5 holes in your bucket, and it's not a bucket. That's my point. That point is that it's deeply harmful on incompleteness, the nature of the knowledge economy and the data economy, and that's why Canada is faltering in these prosperity and citizen wellness effects. That we have to be complete.
Merci, Monsieur Sorbara. Monsieur Villemur, la parole est à vous.
Thank you, Mr. Sorbara. Mr. Villemur. Microphone, please. Microphone. The beginning of the question was inaudible. I'd like to ask you this. The minister referred to a voluntary code of conduct, self-regulations in the area of artificial intelligence. How realistic is that proposal?
Repeat.
Yeah, sorry, can you repeat?
Bon. Monsieur le Président, oui. Vous avez...
Mr. Champagne put forward a voluntary code of conduct for businesses, so self-regulation. I'd like to hear what you think of how realistic that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think, thank you for the question, and apologies for making you repeat it. I think anytime we go into voluntary, we get into trouble. I mean, we see that, I mean, just as a fundamental approach to the work, and so we do have major concerns there. But I would like to pass it to my colleague, Chris, to kind of flesh out what our response is on that.
Just that. I think industry self-regulation in such an important area is precisely not what we need at the moment. We need clear statutory regulatory rules around industry, expectations on industry.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Balsillie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Balsillie. I'd like to hear you on this. The predictable effects of Bill C-27 when we talk about jurisdictions, specifically when you compare the bill to Bill 25 in Quebec, la Loi 25.
Well, and it just went quiet for a second there. To contrast it with Bill 25 and Quebec effect on Quebec, I think the strategic approach of C-27 will disproportionately harm Quebec the worst of any region in Canada for several reasons. Number one, when you commodify social relationships and cultural properties, and they can be exfiltrated and exploited, then you diminish the distinct social society in its control within the province. Second of all, when you create ambiguities or different thresholds between the federal and the province, you'll naturally have lawyers go deeply into exploiting the lower threshold, and you're seeing that happen with federal provincial party data, where they're saying the feds control provincial or federal political data, even though Law 25 says that's a provincial realm. But the position of the lawyers is that is not true in a judicial review happening in British Columbia now. And third is that businesses will naturally arbitrage to the lowest jurisdiction. So picture a river between Quebec and another province, and if there's a high environmental rules on the Quebec side of the river and the lower, the business will go to the lower part, even though it's all the same river. So the best way to protect Quebec and Quebec society and Quebec economy is to make sure that every aspect of this bill is equal to or superior to the principles that are in Law 25, and currently that is not the case.
Last year, there was a report that was referring to the concerns about surveillance around C27. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? What were your concerns?
Well, the nature of the contemporary economy, the data economy, is that you absorb data on people to manipulate them. Mm-hmm. And you use that data to do all kinds of things that that benefit the keeper of the controller of that data who puts them to algorithms. And so my view of this is that you need to deal with this ex ante. Who says you can collect that data? Mm. Who says that you're allowed to manipulate me? And so I come here as representing civil society and as a citizen, that the harms of mismanagement here are deep and they are great. Mm-hmm. And they don't benefit Canada or Canadians in this model. And when I was young, teachers smoked cigarettes in the classroom. And we are going to look back 10 years from now and say, this is remarkably absurd that we did this to our children and to our society. So this is your chance to be on the right side of history. What is good for society and vulnerable and the country and what's not?
Est-ce que vous croyez que
Do you think this bill will allow for users, the ultimate end users, to understand the finality or the purposes of their use of the data? If you consent to something, do you think the user who consents will understand what he or she is consenting to?
No, because so many of the people consent are forced into a consent model, or there's implied consent, or there's no need to disclose there's consent. And then there's aspects of algorithms that who knows if you can contest if you don't know what's going on. And no, this is, look at the mental health crisis for our kids. What is driving this? What does that say about our society? This is a product of manipulation of vulnerable people, whether it's older people or younger people or marginalized people.
C'est de la manipulation dans tous les cas.
It's manipulation in all cases, then.
Vous disiez
Briefly, you were saying that the government had no strategy in this area. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, I went to the government when they said they have the first national AI strategy, and they said there is no document. And that was reported in the news, in the Globe and Mail in February.
Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Villemur.
Thank you, Mr. Villemur. Madam McPherson, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for letting me join you today at this committee. I have some questions for our guests from the Canadian Labour Congress, if I could. So first of all, there has been concerns raised about the risks and limitations of housing the AI and Data Commissioner in the ISED. Could you elaborate on the problems and the concerns of this model and perhaps comment on whether or not it would be more effective, transparent, and accountable if AI and the Data Commissioner was completely independent, like an officer of Parliament, like a parliamentary budget officer? Thank you.
As we've stated, currently by housing it in the same place, we're asking for the promotion of AI to happen, but then also the checks and balances supposedly happening in the same place. So we know that independence will offer an opportunity to ensure that we're meeting the goals, which should be about what is the effect on Canadians, what is the effect on democracy, and those whose job it is to actually promote AI, it's not reasonable to expect that they are also able to put those checks and balances in place. So we believe that it absolutely should be housed separately.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bond. Nice to see you, by the way. I wish I was there in person to see you in person. My next question, as this bill has been introduced in progress over the almost year it has been in the House, there's been many issues raised about the consultations that have taken place. Specifically, there have been concerns raised about the limits of the existing AI Advisory Council as a way to engage civil society on AI. Could you elaborate on these limits and what you would suggest would be a better model?
We are strong believers that social dialogue is our best position to make any decision. And so when we have getting to this point where there hasn't been enough social dialogue, especially, for us involving unions as part of that, we have big concerns because what are we trying to protect? As workers are excited about certain parts of AI, but are also very concerned. And the wrong type of design will send us down a road which could have really huge impacts on people's jobs. And currently, we're not part of that dialogue in a way that we can actually make sure that this is designed so that we are ensuring that this is an opportunity and that we are mitigating the risk to jobs and to workers.
Thank you. Next question. As the evaluation and analysis of this bill has progressed, questions about why we think government and Crown corporations should be included in the scope of the Act has been raised. So perhaps you could just provide some of your thoughts on this and why you think that the government, or why you possibly believe the government and Crown corporations should be included.
Absolutely. From a worker's point of view, by excluding Crown corporations and government, we've excluded a significant amount of workers that are affected by AI. And in a lot of good ways, Crown corporations and our government have invested in AI, are developing AI, but somehow are not going to be, part of the regulation or part of the rules around that, or part of the discussions that we're having and should be having around this bill. So we strongly support all those workers who need to be included so that we can see that we are keeping checks and balances and that there's mandatory rules and regulations around what's being done, in terms of workplaces within the Crown corporations and the government.
Thank you. And then from your perspective, I'd just like a little bit of insight on how AI regulation has been approached in Canada versus the United States, and which mechanisms and which things you prefer.
I think we're all aware of the executive order that came down yesterday, and I think the beginning of that executive order from President Biden starts with the needing to look at how Americans are affected. And I think that's what we should be doing here in Canada, which is how are people being affected? That is the starting point. So how are workers being affected? And then when you look further in terms of what the executive order in the United States is stating, it's also recognizing the impact on workers, its impact on unions, and the role that unions should play in that discussion in terms of designing it. And then also laying out that there needs to be constant evaluation, whether it's around the impact on jobs, but the impact also on equity, which is all work that we believe should continue to work. And so, like we said in the beginning, is that we can design this where we're having discussions and we're putting ourselves in a position of opportunity, or we can be designing this in a way that we're undermining the work that I think we need to do further. So for us, there's not enough balance in terms of approaching this, that it has to be about people, it has to be about workers, and we have to ensure that workers are part of that discussion and respect the commitment that we have in Canada to social dialogue.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, how much time do I have left?
We're just over by 5 seconds, Madam McPherson.
Oh, so I'm all done.
It's about it. Well, but we'll get back to you. I'll now yield the floor to Mr. Viss for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses today. I'm going to start with the Canadian Marketing Association. Ms. Claudman, would you be comfortable collecting and using sensitive information of minors for a socially beneficial purpose as defined in the legislation without the proposed legislation defining what a minor is?
Thank you for the question. The Canadian Marketing Association has...
Your microphone, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. The Canadian Marketing Association has been a leader in developing rules and guidance for marketers when it comes to using children's information, and we have rules that start at anyone under 13 that any use of their data would need the permission, the consent, express consent of the parent.
How can a parent provide express consent for child's information, say when that child might just simply agree to provide consent on a computer application without their parents' knowledge? And how would a company differentiate between data collected in an appropriate way or in certain cases, as you mentioned, when the parent did provide that consent?
So in the case of a child, what our view is that if it's a company that is dealing in in an area where they know that they are specifically reaching children, that they should set up a system. They should set up a system to make sure that they are getting the parental consent.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Would you agree that we might consider looking at the UK model where they've tiered ages of consent? In fact, they have 5 different levels related to minors and how information is collected in each of those circumstances. You mentioned 13 as a threshold age. Can we do a better job in Canada by including in this legislation a specific and detailed protocol that ensures that children are not exploited online for commercial purposes?
So if you're talking about like an online harms type of thing, that would be a different bill than this bill. This
no,
bill
I'm talking about
privacy.
commercial interests in commercial or business interests.
Okay. So in terms of privacy, actually our code does have 3 steps, not 5.
For this legislation, though, not your code, do you believe that we should enshrine very prescriptive language to protect children in this legislation?
That is something I'd have to take back to my membership in terms of how detailed it
for
should be
your
in the
time.
legislation.
Mr. Basili, in your report, well, first off, thank you for your comments in the beginning. I really do feel, and I'm very concerned about this bill. I think it is broken, primarily because the minister came before our committee and said he wanted to protect children, but didn't define what a fundamental right to privacy would be for a child in the legislation, even though it's the second iteration of this bill itself. That's very problematic for me. On page 5 of your report for Not Fit for Purpose, Canada Deserves Much Better, you mention on page 5, most importantly, this bill, it fails to address the reality that has emerged since PIPEDA was enacted. Most importantly, it fails to address the reality that dominant data-driven enterprises have shifted away from a service-oriented business model towards one that relies on monetizing personal information. I am so concerned about the mental health crisis you outlined in respect to youth and the vulnerabilities that children face every day when they go online, even in their own classroom, as was outlined in the Globe and Mail in a report last year. Is there any circumstance, are we getting to the point that we need to put the hammer down as legislators and go really, really far in protecting children in this bill? Because we have no idea the harms that are going to come their way in the next 10 or 15 years.
Welcome your question, and not to drop names, but I keep very close relationships with good friends in this, like Biban Kidron, who did the U.S. Kids for Rights, and Shoshana Zuboff, who I'm very close to, and we'll be here together in February in Ottawa, and many other development psychologists. And fundamentally, when we all grew up, when something happened to you, you went into your bedroom and you licked your wounds for a couple hours or a day, and you came back out. And in this current process where you cannot retreat and you cannot heal, and there's a permanent record of this, it undermines the healthy developmental process.
So
and I could go on and on. Sorry.
Please let me. I have very limited time. Sorry,
Mr. Viss, I'm sorry, your time's out, and your microphone, there's something wrong with it. So out of courtesy for the interpreters, so we'll stop it there. And I'll now turn to Madame Lapointe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
For Ms. Krugel. So some stakeholders have raised concerns about the fine balance that we need to ensure that the privacy of Canadians is fully protected through this legislation, while also allowing for the positive benefits of online tools that use data to drive innovation. What is your perspective on how we can find that appropriate balance?
So, well, we believe that PIPEDA actually did have a lot of elements around this, that did have organizations already consider what was reasonable and what would be reasonable uses relating to the personal information. And that was a lot in the Privacy Commissioner's guidance. Now we see the CPPA is taking those good things from PIPEDA and encoding the Privacy Commissioner's guidance around, again, appropriate uses and reasonability. And so when it comes to innovation, We believe that there is a need for organizations to be able to leverage the information in a responsible way. To be able to do this, and we see that in some of the areas where there's more permission to use de-identified information for internal research and development and analytics purposes, again, in a real responsible way. We do want to make sure that there's appropriate limits on some of this as well. We do have a concern with respect to the prohibition on re-identifying information, because we believe that a lot of organizations, when they do their analysis and looking for ways to innovate, that they often will de-identify information just to keep it safe. And when you have a prohibition on re-identifying it, then organizations won't do de-identification just for safeguarding. So we think that that's one area where there's an improvement that can be made, but that there's the use of de-identified information for internal purposes is very welcome.
Thank you. My next question is for Ms. Clodman. You mentioned in the opening statement that your organization serves many small to medium-sized enterprises. Can you tell this committee that what would be the key considerations for SMEs in privacy law, and to that, in your view, does the Consumer Privacy Protection Act reflect these considerations?
Thank you for the question. I think that the most important thing is to take into account the variable capabilities of SMEs when they are collecting data, and I think that the bill does achieve that. It does need a few tweaks in order to really help SMEs, and one of the most significant ones would be in the area of children's data. There's a careful consideration has to be made when thinking about what the rules should be, and the simple provision that's in the bill right now is a very blunt instrument to deal with a very, very important topic. So, for example, if a child goes to Canadian Tire to buy a mug, if any person goes to Canadian Tire to buy a mug, if this provision was the way it's written, then the Canadian Tire would have to determine if that person was a minor, and if so, the data would have to be bucketed separately. Like, it's day-to-day transactions like that for not just large organizations, but small organizations. They would have to be able to keep track of which of their customers were minors, and when they're not selling products to minors or apps and things that, where there are concerns, then it's a lot of extra administrative work that is very costly for small business.
Can you tell us how the exceptions to consent in the Consumer Privacy Protection Act compare to the European Union's privacy laws?
Let me start by saying that consent and informed consent is extremely important in any privacy law, and those rules exist as well. And clear disclosure, which this CPPA calls for clearer disclosure than it has built on the existing rules. But the Achilles heel of disclosure is consent fatigue, and in Europe, people have to consent to so much all of the time that they don't read carefully the notices about what they're consenting to. So their consent becomes less well-informed. And that is a very major issue and something that we'd like to avoid here.
Merci, Madame Lapointe. Monsieur Villemur.
Mr. Villemur. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madame Vipon, I wanted to ask you a question again. In my riding of Trois-Rivières, we have a lot of creatives, people in a number of media types live off of their work. Does this legislation protect them? Are they protected, these creators?
Thank you for the question. This is a big concern that folks that work in the creative industries have, because, again, it's about the discussion, but what does a compensation model look like? We're hearing that a lot in the media right now around performers, and where, their image can be looked at or can be used past the point, and so are they being compensated properly? We also hear from, the creation, whether it's writing or that kind of creation of art, and what happens to that afterwards. And I don't think it's being addressed in an appropriate way, but also we aren't setting the table for those those workers to be at the table to actually have those discussions so that we can be building it in the right way.
Mr. Belsilli,
Mr. Belsilli, on the question of these creators, Do you think this bill, as it is, protects them?
No, I do not. I think the mistake with the creators, particularly in Madame Vaipan's comment on AI, the government put the shoes on first and now is trying to put on their socks. And we have to start over, because you begin with the consultation and the dialogue with the stakeholders, then you create your white paper, then you go to legislation. And now we're trying to figure out what to do with our socks without taking off our shoes. And we just have to take them off and start over.
Creators in my riding are very concerned. In fact, they feel powerless. What could be done to improve the bill in order to reassure them?
Well, we have to understand that we live in a world of digital mediation that's got economic and non-economic effects. But how we govern these are social structures. When the car was invented, we decided there should be speed limits and blood alcohol limits in front of schools. And it's the same here. In economics, you begin with norms. You define what you value, and then you work back from there with an appropriate toolkit. And we do have the toolkits to achieve our norms, but we have to put our norms up front, and then we have to be cognizant of what's an effective toolkit to manifest it. I think you have all the power in the world to create historic legislation here. I just want to see that you actually manifest the norms that you care about.
Je suis très heureux d'entendre votre référence.
I'm quite pleased to hear your reference to standards and values. As an ethicist myself, this has to be the basic foundation in order to create this type of legislation, an exemplary legislation. You mentioned that political parties are not subject to C-27. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. In Europe, for adequacy, and don't assume this bill will get adequacy in Europe, the two most sensitive types of information are children information and political party political information. And it was not included in C-27, and there's a minimum standard in British Columbia, and the political parties under the budget bill are claiming that they trump that under a judicial review right now, which is effectively no oversight whatsoever. So it shows that you're playing with our democratic structures, our adequacy globally, and what is constitutional realm for the provinces in the federal here. And I don't know for what purpose. I don't see anything wrong with raising an appropriate standard and then putting the proper toolkit to look after the country we all love.
Vous avez mentionné Madame Zuboff.
Madame Zuboff, a little earlier, you mentioned this. Do you think that C-27 will encourage surveillance capitalism, or do you think it will actually counter it, reduce it?
C-27 turbocharges surveillance capitalism. And I talked to Shoshana last week, and we worked through this, and she's coming here in February. So, yeah, no, this turbocharges it.
C'est très intéressant, merci. Madame.
Very interesting, thank you. Madame Fortin-Lefebvre, do you think C-27 should be in line with Quebec legislation and that Quebec's law should prevail? Our members have said that on some points, specific points, we should align things with Bill 27 from Quebec, or Loi 25, specifically with respect to minors. The age is 14 in Quebec. We should rely on that. And then the definition of anonymizing, as well as the scope of the private right of action. Apologies for using English. So these are a number of issues. The issue is interoperability. We know that a number of businesses are already aligned with Bill C-20, or Bill 25 rather, in Quebec, because it was adopted last year. A number of businesses, many of them, have said that yes, we should keep up with a number of those aspects of that legislation. Thank you very much, Mr. Villemur. Madam McPherson, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Basili, I have a question for you about the Privacy Tribunal. So similar to what exists as the Competition Tribunal, where decisions, rulings, or potential orders of the Privacy Commissioner would be challenged by organization or businesses, as this has been demonstrated by the Competition Bureau rejecting and reversing the decisions of the Competition Bureau Commissioner, the case of Rogers' takeover of Shaw, for example. Other countries do not have this additional quasi-judicial body that seems to obstruct what independent agencies have decided. And parties to these decisions of the Privacy Commissioner can always go to federal court, like in other countries, if they disagree with the decision. In fact, they can go to federal court even to appeal the decisions of the Privacy Tribunal. What is your opinion of the Privacy Tribunal? Is this an extra layer that just delays function and will hinder the Privacy Commissioner's office from carrying out their necessary functions and enforcing their decisions?
I don't know who came up with this idea of a tribunal. I think it's a mistake. It shouldn't be there. It undermines the courts. It undermines the commissioner. And I think it just adds another layer, as you've said. And if you're a corporation trying to negotiate with the commissioner, you'll just shrug your shoulders and say, I'll see you in the tribunal, which is quasi-judicial. And why do we need it when we have perfectly legitimate courts that are bound by all the jurisprudence? No other country in the world has it. Nobody asked for it. Who in the world inserted this? Under what kind of consultation? When I saw it, I thought, who did this?
That's very clear. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Risley. Ms. Bipon, could you provide your perspective on that as well, please?
Yeah, I mean, for us, there has to be an ability for checks and balances. And so, as we've said before, that it needs to exist outside of that process. And then overall, when we're just looking at who has a say on the decision making, we're just always going to go back to that we're not there yet. We need to have more social dialogue before we get to the point of looking past that point. But yeah.
Thank you. And I'll just stick with you for one last question very quickly. So why should directors and officers be held personally liable for violations of their businesses?
Because people make decisions, and those decisions have impacts. And this idea that you are suddenly not responsible for what happens alleviates a chain of responsibility that needs to exist. We see this when we're looking at almost all labor law, where it's, if you make decisions in a workplace that has an effect, if you make decisions that are going to have an effect, you should be liable or you should be responsible for those decisions. And so that's why we're advocating for that.
Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Généreux, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses, and welcome to the great darkness of the Liberal reign. Clearly, I get the feeling it's as though it's just a dog chasing its own tail. Here we're talking about a situation where a minister appeared before us 3 weeks ago saying that there would be 8 amendments, including some major ones in the bill. Mr. Balzelli, you said earlier that you had been consulted by Minister Baines at the time on what was it, C11? And that you had made recommendations at the time, I would imagine, because he consulted you. Now, the current minister, Mr. Champagne, says he consulted with 300 organizations, specialists. You apparently were not in that group, or perhaps a number of you were not in the group of people that were consulted, probably because today you're asking for more consultations, and that there were some, that there would be some during the creation of this bill. Mr. Balzelli, up until this point, all the comments you've made about this bill have been negative. Do you see anything potentially positive in this bill, or do you think we should just throw this out and start fresh? Because something is obvious to me. Mixing privacy with artificial intelligence, these are two very distinct things, and now you're combining them. And we'd like to hear what you have to say about AI. I think pretty convinced that you would have liked to have more time to tell us about this, so please go ahead.
Yes, I would like to put the sock on first with AI. First of all, I said in my testimony we should start over with AI. I agree. Second of all, I think the tribunal should be scrapped. There's no purpose for it other than to undermine the effective process. I do think the privacy provisions can be fixed, but you have to fix them comprehensively, and that's why I use the allegory of a bucket, that if you leave 1 or 2 holes in the bucket, it's not a bucket, but you can patch all the buckets. But it is not a bargain to say, I'll give you 10 holes to fix, but I'm going to leave 10 holes. You can patch all the holes in the privacy, but you must do it. There's no reason that I can see legitimate for the tribunal, and I think the artificial intelligence is so central, so comprehensive, it has to be done right or it'll be forever toxic.
Mesdames, la Chambre de commerce du Canada.
From the Chamber of Commerce of Canada, I'm a businessman. I've had 40 employees in a variety of businesses, and we're in this quagmire of bureaucracy and throughout all of our businesses. And do you think businesses of 100 employees or less, because you hear about this in the bill, 100 or less, would not be subject to the Act or would be subject to it in a different way? Because when you have a small enterprise, you know that it's the backbone, economic backbone of the country. These same businesses, should they be treated differently?
C'est une bonne question.
That's a good question. It's not a subject that we presented in our presentation. You're referring to the bill as a whole, specifically AI, or specifically 7-Eleven that's calling for a lot of bureaucratic or paperwork for these companies that need to comply with the Act. Look, we're always concerned about always trying to improve processes and helping SMEs survive. I'd like to turn to my members to ask them that question specifically. But generally speaking, if there's anything that can be supportive to our small SMEs, we're champions for them. Madame Vipon, have you been consulted?
Well, this is part of, I guess, of that process, but we think can be a more meaningful way that is at the table, because as we said, we're very concerned about the design, meaning that it is going to, undo and maybe, talk about like against human rights if AI isn't designed properly.
My question is, have you been consulted for this piece of
I guess
legislation?
we're here, but yeah, we think it could be more.
Before, dans les 300 personnes
out of these 300 organizations and businesses, I mean, you represent 3 million members, I believe. 3 million employees throughout the country in a number of sectors. You have never been consulted.
Non, Monsieur Généreux.
No, Mr. Généreux. Thank you. Mr. Turnbull, you have the floor.
And thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. It's a really useful discussion. Ms. Krugel, maybe I'll start with you from the Banking Association. I think the banks generally have a clear understanding of what this will look like federally, the CPPA. Will this bill help raise the floor from your perspective for businesses across the country? Well, that was a very... Oh, no problem.
Yeah, thank you. So we believe that the CPPA takes what's best from PIPEDA and strengthens it. And we think also it's very important that the federal law be a guiding principle for when the provinces start their privacy reform. Obviously, Quebec has done theirs already, but we know that there are other provinces that are looking to do their own thing, and it'd be very helpful to have consistency and interoperability. So it would be in the best interest of both organizations of all sizes and also for consumers to have a consistent experience across provinces and federally.
And you think that's possible with the way the bill is already worded?
With some targeted amendments, which we have put out in our proposal.
Okay, thank you for that. Ms. Klodman, I hear your point about consent fatigue. I thought that was a really good point. I myself have experienced that, although obviously informed consent is very, very important. I think the notion of norms, though, came up earlier, and I think your opening remarks, you had mentioned that consumers want protections. They also want services to be delivered intuitively. They also want to share data and kind of expect to receive discounts, or at least that data is helping, provide them with discounts, and that often that is kind of implied, and that people value personalization. I think many of us can probably agree that that's part of the norms that I think exist out there today in terms of consumer behavior and their relationships with different types of businesses. So from my perspective, based on your comments, it sounds like, contrary to what Mr. Basili had said, that it is a balance. So could you speak to that balance and getting it right a little bit more?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. It is very much important to remember that this bill has two purposes, and we believe that both of those purposes can be fulfilled in harmony. You know, one is to protect consumer personal information, which is extremely important, and then the other is to enable businesses to succeed and to innovate. And, you know, I think what we need at the end of the day is to make sure that where we have a situation where a customer would not expect their data to be used in a certain way, that consumer should have the opportunity to consent through express consent to agree to the use of their data. But in cases where a consumer would expect their data to be used in a certain way for the regular business activities, that they should not be asked to consent, because that is when consent fatigue happens.
It's sort of, I can see how that makes sense. I can also see the flip side, that there's some drawbacks to that, in potentially, because how do we know what consumers expect? I mean, we'd have to have quite a lot of information about that. Do you feel confident that this bill is getting it right in terms of how it's defining legitimate interests and the various clauses that are there that I think layer on, you know, some, or imply some understanding of where those boundaries are?
The bill requires organizations, including not-for-profits, who are looking to find their funders and to communicate with those funders. The bill requires that the organization make decisions about whether it is a regular activity, and if they make the wrong decision under this bill, they are subject to significant fines, to orders from the commissioner that can require them to stop collecting and using data, and as well as reputational damage, and also the potential of a private right of action. So those are very, very significant incentives for companies to get it right.
Thank you for that. Mr. Bohm, we haven't shown you enough love today. I don't think it seems like the people in the room have gotten the preference. So I wanted to ask you a question. You had described in your opening remarks some, I think, significant benefits to the rights to data mobility and portability included in CPPA. Can you maybe further elaborate on some of those, just so we can get, like, anything that you didn't have a chance to say in your opening remarks that you could put on the record?
Thank you for the question. Indeed. So data portability in the financial services context bestows upon it the ability of a consumer or SME to choose the tool, the product or service that is best suited for them. There is not nearly as much competition in the financial services sector in Canada as exists in multiple other jurisdictions. And because Canada does not have this data portability right, consumers and SMEs may find themselves stuck with their current service provider in Canada, which doesn't help push down fees, doesn't help improve service, doesn't help improve products or tools. And it can be a significant barrier to SMEs and consumers who are trying to improve their financial life when they can't find a tool or product that's best suited for them. So the data portability right, in our view, brings Canada on par with many other countries that have gone further than Canada has so far.
Thank you, Chair. Do I have any more time? Or? I think I'm okay. Thanks.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Turnbull. Monsieur Falk.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. Mr. Falk.
To all of our witnesses for coming here, Mr. Basili, I'd like to start with you. You talked a lot about, in your comments and in your responses to questions, about personal privacy, surveillance, and protecting prosperity. When you were the co-CEO of BlackBerry, you demonstrated that. I don't think there's anybody in this room that has been the custodian of more personal, private data than you have been. So you're going to be speaking from a position of authority, experience, and knowledge. And you prioritized individual security and privacy for people. And that's why 10 years ago when I became an MP, BlackBerry was the only option we had as telephones, and because of the security aspect of it. During COVID, this government, together with their coalition NDP partners, through the Public Health Agency of Canada, colluded with TELUS to trample on Canadians' individual privacy by tracking them.
Is that the kind of thing that you're concerned with this legislation? It doesn't protect Canadians from that kind of behavior. They did it without a judicial authorization.
I think, if I may, I'm going to answer this a little indirectly in that I dialogue a lot at the subnational with the premiers who are grappling with issues of data and identity systems and so on and so forth. And people like to talk about the efficiency. And I explain to them that you must first invest in trust and governance. Somebody can't build a 20-story skyscraper in your backyard without talking to you. You are all politicians who go through policy discourse. And yet when it comes to these digital realms, there's a tendency to bypass the trust and governance phase, and yet the power and impact is profound. And so the most important thing is the elements of dialogue, the elements of transparency, the elements of governance, so that people know that they can trust what you're doing and that there's going to be democratic recourse if you slip over the line. That's okay. But if you come top down or you do it with absent transparency or with sneaky carve-outs, it collapses trust, and that shuts down a lot of things, independent of the harms that these things do. You lose the social license to move ahead in an era where we need social license, because we can't ignore the potential of these digital technologies to help us in a pandemic. But there's a proper way to do these things, and there's an undermining way to do these things.
How much time have we got left? I have 3 minutes, okay. Ms. Fortin-Lefebvre, Canadian Chamber of Commerce, you said you really haven't consulted with your members as to how they would feel about the additional reporting requirements that this bill would demand of small businesses. What do you expect the response to be? I know when the CFIB recently came to my office and gave me responses from the members that they have in my riding, they reported back that one of the biggest concerns that small businesses have is the reporting requirements and the red tape. Would you get the same feedback through your members?
Could you have a response to that?
Well, I gladly jump in here. As the Canadian, first of all, thank you for the question, Mr. Falk. As the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, we don't have a large number of small businesses that we represent. Though it is very diverse across sectors and across jurisdictions and industries as well. So the few that we have engaged with haven't really commented on it, if I may say so. We do engage in consultations with all our members. As I'm leading actually most of the innovation and digital economy files and committees, and through that, and haven't heard back in particular, I must say, from the portion of the small to medium-sized businesses. However, you may wish to define them. I think it was mentioned earlier, 100 employees or less. It depends sometimes on the jurisdiction. I actually, having resided in Nova Scotia for a long time, I think it was even less than that. So they have not been proactively actually participated in the dialogue, but I can envision that there are great burdens that they would align or basically attach to any reporting and so forth. But I can't comment and shouldn't on behalf, as they haven't voiced it as such. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je passerai maintenant la parole à Monsieur.
Thank you very much. Mr. Villebert. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Balsillie, you referred to how difficult it is to ensure interoperability with Europe in the context of C27. Could you give a bit more detail on that front?
Absolutely. First of all, I was commenting on adequacy, that you maintain, you have to maintain a threshold that to interact with Europeans into the Canadian realm. And so when you look at elements very simply, how you deal with children's data and how you deal with political party data, that just won't, I don't believe that would survive a test. And politicians can talk all they want, but it goes to a court, and if the judge says, just like they did in the Schrems 2 decisions, you get shut down, and then you have to fix it in an emergency. And again, why not do it right the first time to protect Canadian business and to protect Canadian citizens? So just do it right.
do you think C27, as it stands currently, would be good legislation when you consider generative AI or ChatGPT?
No, and I think what's happened since the original draft of this is generative technologies have come into the fore. So we used to think of data and then you run an algorithm against it to get a result. Now you have data and an algorithm trains off it and says goodbye. I will say, and this is beyond the scope of this committee, you now have to think of what is infrastructure of a sovereign country, because Europe has done what's called Gaia X, a sovereign cloud. They're doing sovereign language models, because just to protect your data but not control the rest of it, in a sense, it'd be like us having our water treatment but not having our sovereign wastewater treatment. What is a sovereign country in an era of data and generative AI? And we have to start thinking of what is national infrastructure and what is sovereign infrastructure. So I chaired a panel on this subnational, and I would extend to the infrastructure given what's developed in the past year, but our mandate was done a year ago. So yeah, we got to get with it. And Europe's been doing sovereign infrastructure, Gaia X, with 2 billion euros for 4 years. They've got their big summit this next week in Spain. They've got hundreds of companies. They've got an interoperability framework. They've got a permissioning framework. They've got an index of sharing. We should just draft right off it, and we could do it federally and provincially. It's open source. Infrastructure has to be talked about as part of this digital realm of data. It's there.
Inaudible to the interpreter. Trust is social capital. Do you think, you have to perhaps start from scratch with C27? This social capital would be imperiled.
Yes, I chaired a panel on a data authority for the province of Ontario, and I've been talking to them. And in these elements of new privacy legislation and digital sharing protocols, it's a persistent, structured form of consultation, including labor, including parents, including all kinds of communities, so that the license has to be developed and maintained, because this moves laterally. Mm-hmm. So, yes, I think social license needs to be a central part of the ongoing operating realm of data, both in public and private sector.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Elder.
Thank you very much, Mr. Elder. You specialize in privacy law. I'd like to know, do you think the average user currently understands when he says he consents, what that actually means in terms of consent?
I'm sorry, I missed part of that. I wasn't getting the volume.
Je vais recommencer.
I'll start again. Do you believe that the average user understands when he clicks I consent what the end result of that will be, what the consent means?
Well, I think it depends very much on the scenario that you're talking about. I think, sometimes there's some pretty simple data uses. We've got to remember that this bill, for example, covers a wide range of industries and businesses. Mm-hmm. So I think certainly in more simple transactions, I would think in many cases, yes. I think if you're talking about a more complicated transaction and use of algorithms, I'm not sure that the average user would always necessarily.
Mais lorsqu'on clique j'accepte pour le journal Le Figaro, là.
Let's say you consent to Le Figaro. You click I consent. Will the average user, the citizen, understand what the use will be of that data that they've consented to?
I suppose it depends on whether they've read the document to which they're consenting and understand the privacy policy.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Merci, Monsieur Villemur. I'll now yield the floor to MP Van Bynen. And sorry, I skipped you in the last round, but the floor is yours, MP Van Bynen. Okay, well, yeah, but I went from Mr. Falk to Mr. Villemur, and usually it should have been Mr. Van Bynen. So,
okay,
the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. My question will be to Ms. Krugel, particularly with respect to the Canadian Bankers Association. What barriers would an organization have to overcome to meet the new obligations under the Consumer Privacy Protection Act?
So you're asking what are the net new obligations compared to today?
And how substantive are they? And in terms of implementation, what would it take?
Yes, there's a number that are actually quite substantive. They are when PIPEDA is a very principles-based, so organizations have been able to scale what they do according to the circumstance. Under the CPPA, it takes inspiration from some of the other, like GDPR and Quebec, some of the key concepts that are very prescriptive. And some of those can be very, it can take a lot to implement. For example, relating to the automated decision system, this is a provision that goes beyond what GDPR and Quebec do. Both Quebec and GDPR only focus on scenarios that are exclusively automated, and the organization would need to tell the individual when a decision is solely automated. But under the CPPA, organizations will have to consider all of the automated systems, which could be AI systems, or they could be even an Excel spreadsheet that is automated, and have an understanding if they assist in the decision making or making of a prediction or recommendation. So there's a lot the organization would need to take a look at almost everything that they do and be prepared to provide explanations to individuals, which is, with respect to training and understanding all of these processes can be quite cumbersome. So that's one element.
So 2-year cycle for
yes,
implementation.
Yes. So some of these requirements, any changes to consent and anything that requires changes to system can take a very long runway, particularly in larger, complex organizations. Even printing out new consent forms and ordering paper can be also very time-consuming. Getting access to legal experts to make sure that you're understanding the requirements, particularly if there are differences between federal and provincial requirements, and technology resources as well. So there's scarce resources that need to be shared amongst all organizations to be able to understand requirements to comply.
Okay, then Section 76 and 81 of the Consumer Privacy Protection Act would provide for a procedure allowing organizations subject to the Act to create codes of practice and certification programs that would go to the Privacy Office or the Privacy Commission for approval. Would your organization submit a code of practice to the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, and that would apply to all your members? Would that be your intentions?
So it would depend. Certainly a code of practice could be beneficial if there's a certain area where there could be a potential for differing interpretations of what is the required. So it could set out rules that organizations would follow that would be basically there would be additional trust provided by the Privacy Commissioner to say, yes, this is the type of approach that would be supported under the CPPA. So it can provide trust to consumers that it's been reviewed, but also trust and certainty to organizations. Whether or not the Canadian Bankers Association would choose a specific code of practice, we haven't gone down that far just yet.
Okay. I understand your organization does have codes of practice in terms of certification for investment advisors, et cetera.
Not under the Canadian Bankers Association. The banking industry does have some codes of practice, and I think there's also with respect to credit practices.
Okay, I'd like to go with the same question over to Ms. Klodman. In terms of your organization, would you be instituting codes of practice that would be subject to the approval of the Privacy Commissioner?
We haven't made a final decision yet about that, but we would. We are talking about a code of practice around marketing because we already have the Canadian Marketing Code of Ethics and Standards, and also possibly one related to the use of children's data. Again, because we have that in place and have had it for many years.
And that was the reason I wanted to approach you on that. Is you've established your own code, and so I was trying to determine your intent with respect to setting the same standards, because setting up those certificate programs goes back to the value-based principles that you want organizations to accept. And so I was trying to get a better understanding as to whether or not the two organizations that you represent would be pursuing the values-based principles in applying your consideration as to how you would go forward with this. Go ahead.
So with respect to a code of practice, we understand too there might be some certain very narrow scenarios that could really benefit from a code of practice. For example, information sharing could be something that's very specific. But generally speaking, for the banking sector, each of our banks has very robust privacy management programs already in place under PIPEDA. So we wouldn't necessarily look to create a code of practice for all of compliance for the CPPA, although we could see some very good benefit for small and medium-sized businesses, for example.
How much time do I have, Mr. Chair?
You're over by a minute 20.
Okay.
Mr. Van Lynen, so yeah, I know. Thank you very much. And now for our final round of questions, I'll yield the floor to Madam McPherson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you to all the witnesses for their testimony today. Mr. Basili, in your brief, you recommended establishing a complaint funding mechanism to help finance legal proceedings brought by individual or group complainants and or public interest organizations seeking remedies against organizations for alleged contravention of the CPPA. Can you explain why this is important and why it's essential to this regulatory process?
There's a structural asymmetry in the nature of this evidence where you click a consent, where somebody writes a sophisticated consent and then somebody does click, or the individual doesn't have the ability to exploit their data, but a large company can. And also, there's also a market failure in the ability to actually follow through in a complaint. And so what you're really trying to do here is create rebalancing mechanisms so that the public good is served.
So just to make sure that I have this right, so could you explain perhaps why a private right to action is important, as has been the case in other jurisdictions such as the United States?
An individual who thinks they've been harmed has the ability to file a complaint and use the judicial system to say they've been harmed and not appeal to a busy regulator who is grappling with budget constraints and multiple priorities and possibly different points of view based on their circumstance.
Thank you. Perhaps our guests from the CLC would also like to comment on that. Or perhaps not. Oh, there we go. I don't think your microphone is on.
Oh.
So I can't hear you. Sorry.
Yeah, could you just repeat the question for me?
Sorry, just the idea of using a complaint funding mechanism to help finance legal proceedings, whether or not you would be in agreement with that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like, there needs to be an ability for folks to work through it and make a complaint, but we have to just make sure that when that happens, that the right people are the ones listening to it, so that there's an ability to respond in a reasonable way.
Thank you. Ms. Vipond, I also was going to ask you, has the CLC considered specific changes to this bill that would help to include labor laws or provisions to ensure the concerns you've raised are addressed? And could you elaborate a little bit on those? Are there other countries or jurisdictions that have done so that you would be considering when you include these?
I will say that one of our recommendations is that ADA should be reconceived, and that's from a human, labor, and privacy rights-based perspective, so that we can place transparency, accountability, and consultation at the core of the approach to AI, which is not what we see in front of us. So that is a big ask. But we are looking to that executive order in the United States as having better language than we're seeing. We also see examples in other jurisdictions where if it's being approached in terms of from a social dialogue sense. So we do have many asks about this, but I think fundamentally that is a big one, right? And then I just need to reiterate, we have to expand who's covered and that the government and crown corporations cannot be excluded. And that comes from a workers' rights perspective.
Wonderful, thank you. And then the last question that I have for you. What recourse mechanisms that are still missing in the bill with regards to algorithms or data collection, use, and permissions that could impact the relations between employees or employees would you like to see included in this bill?
Concern. We hear lots of workers telling us about how AI is being used in terms of surveillance in the workplace as well as a human rights that excludes a person. That the process, that there's actually no human intervention in that process, and that is a huge concern for us. And so that is one of the big things we're looking at when we're talking about what needs to be readdressed here is that we cannot have, as it's currently, the mechanisms that are currently laid out in ADA are not giving us enough of an opportunity to kind of talk about that and also regulate it, because unregulated goes unchecked, and then we're going to fall into a position where human rights, including workers' rights, are not going to be respected.
Thank you very much, and that's all from me, Chair.
Thank you very much, Madam McPherson. So we're almost done, but Mr. Perkins has one last question, so I trust it will be short, Mr. Perkins.
That's a challenge for me. I'd love to ask the Canadian Bankers Association something, but I'll leave that to afterwards maybe. Mr. Basili, who owns somebody's data, the individual or a company?
You can't really own data. It's about control of the data. And so, but the question of who's allowed to collect it in the first place, that's a lawlessness. We're living in a lawless world right now. So people are just doing it without any real laws that says what you're allowed to do in the first place. And then you just, it's a colonizing personal space is what's happening in a lawlessness right now.
Very short.
Canadian Bankers Association, you mentioned earlier about Section 35, which I did as well. The current Privacy Act limits that power to use it without knowledge for research and statistics to academic type things. This complete replacement leaves it wide open because it just says an organization. It doesn't limit it to scholastic or academic. Could you comment on that?
Actually, that was not. We did not provide any recommendations relating to that one. Sorry, what is the concern on that one? But using.
So Section 35 says an organization may disclose an individual's personal information without their knowledge or consent if they use it for statistical or study or research purposes, which is pretty wide open. Previously in PEPITA, it limited to scholarly work. That leaves it open to anybody, any organization to do it without consent, in my view.
So I'm not sure that would be a provision that our members would be looking to leverage for the internal research and analysis that they do.
I can tell you, as a former bank marketer, I would exploit that very well.
Well, we'll leave it at that, Mr. Perkins.
Monsieur le Président.
Oui, Monsieur Généreux.
Point of order. Mr. Généreux says, Mr. Chair, I'd like to start by thanking our witnesses. I'm making a point of order because the quality of the witnesses that we've had since the beginning of this study is striking. I'd like us to have more time with each witness, have fewer witnesses at a meeting for future meetings. Yes, Mr. Généreux, usually we have a cap at 5 people, but we wanted a full panel today. We certainly did get that. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your wisdom, and I thank you also to the interpreters and the support staff, the analysts, the clerk. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you.